I won't be talking about Hungary, but since I'm coming from there, just let me tell you that we have solved the problem of historical revisionism, because we went from the phase of denying the Holocaust to the phase of approving of it. You know, and the valid version on the extreme and the radical right, and not simultaneous, not synonymous, is that the Holocaust never took place, and it was a good thing too. Right, and so you know, in the city of Budapest, all the names of the members of the anti-Hitler resistance have been taken off the streets. And first, of course, it was the communist martyrs who went. Then it was the Social Democrats. And now it's President Roosevelt who doesn't have a square any longer. And so, right, so it's a pleasant humanistic environment in which we are thriving. But to get to where I want to go. The first and paradigmatic move of historical revisionism was, of course, when Ernst Nolte and Andreas Hillgruber explained to us that the Nazi regime was a reaction to Bolshevism, which to a very large extent actually it was, but that, of course, gave it the sort of historical legitimacy that has put it into the sphere of normalcy. And not only that, the indeed, National Socialism in Germany, to a very large extent, was a response to left radicalism in Germany, and so was Mussolini's onslaught earlier, and so was the Hungarian and other extreme rights and Pilsudski's authoritarian regime and so on and so forth. But historical revisionism has presented this reaction, to the extent it was a reaction, as something that embodied the self-defense of the West. The self-defense of the West from an Asiatic, that was the term, famous term of Nolte, against an Asiatic danger. Asiatic not denoting, not meaning, in this case, the ethnic origin of the Bolsheviks, but what he considered, and his fellow historians, fellow revisionists, considered to be the danger of a social order and an order of things that had been characteristic for the East, be that whatever it may be. Now, okay. So that, of course, has been accepted to a very large extent, to a much larger extent than it is acknowledged, because you had in the 1970s and 1980s to legitimize the last onslaught against the Soviet system, and therefore the general totalitarian theory and the declaration of the equality in value of the Nazi system and of the Soviet system were necessary. There are many versions of this, and the most important, historically most important version of equalizing Nazism and Bolshevism was the liberal version, not the extreme Nolte-Hillgruber version, which was indeed went too far, and it went as far as to betray a little liking, a little sympathy even for the national revolution in Germany. Well, not perhaps for Hitler, but for people like Ernst Jünger and Gottfried Benn and others, Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger and others, who were representing the national revolution idea in its purity and without the vulgarities of Schicklgruber. But the liberal version stated the following, and this is still the dominant paradigm. And I'll come to Serbia in 2 minutes. This is the dominant paradigm, namely that socialism and National Socialism and fascism and such like are characterized by a few traits. A, that they are collectivistic, whatever that might mean again, i.e. opposed to liberal individualism and individual human rights and private liberties and so on and so forth. Collectivistic, irrational, proposing goals that go against, allegedly, go against economic rationality and the sober and proper way of doing things in a state. Irrational, so it's equated with passion. The liberal order and liberal capitalism and liberal democracy are an order based on the head, and totalitarian collectivism on the heart, or even lower. And stomach, I meant. And you know, and thirdly, collectivistic, irrational, passional, and non-Western, non-European, or anti-Western, anti-European. So from the defense of so-called liberal principles, we went to the defense of European values, whatever they are. The expression is totally meaningless. What are European values? Marx was not a European, Goethe was not a European, Hitler was not a European, Milosevic was not a European. What? It doesn't mean anything, but nevertheless. But we all know what it means. It means anything that the mainstream Western governance does not approve of, right? Okay. That's the non-Western. And so we went from principles to values, and values are different from principles in a very interesting way, because values pertain to identities. Therefore, criticizing values or opposing values has something to do with the dignity of those who are proposing those values. Principles are something you can discuss. Principles are correct or not, true or not, inspiring or not. But values, you know, if you say that I'm opposed to your values, that means that I'm opposed to you and I don't respect you. Therefore, the attack against Western values is interpreted as lack of respect from the subaltern. Now, how did Serbia, or little Yugoslavia before with Montenegro, in the 1990s become the absolute test case of whatever the new market-based liberal humanist European community was supposed to be opposed to, quite putting aside to whatever happened. It was a combination of elements which satisfied the new taste of liberalism based on totalitarianism theory to a very large extent. Serbs, as opposed to, say, Croats and Slovenes, are Greek Orthodox. Therefore, like the Russians, and the Russians were not any longer, they couldn't fill that role. They, of course, represented the East. They were supposed to be communist in the Milosevic mold. And indeed, Milosevic used a sort of very strange quasi-communist rhetoric, and even the rhetoric of anti-fascism, of partisans of Yugoslavia, and so on. So he was referring very largely to the state socialist past and identified with it. Therefore, that past could be identified with him. And it was nationalist. So nationalism Bolshevism and the East were reunited in the absolute evil of Serbia at that time, in which it was, I know it from experience, to treat about the conflict between Serbia and its competitors, its rivals, its adversaries, its enemies, name it as you will, as a conflict between nations, or, you know, combined with elements of civil war. It was absolutely impossible because Serbia represented the repressed other in Europe, and especially in Eastern and Central Europe. It was the evil within us. This is why it was so, the whole thing was so profound. This is why in countries such as, you know, Hungary, Austria, Germany, Poland, etc., 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 it provoked a great deal of very passionate responses in which people tried to show that while repudiating Serbia's national aspirations, whether they were justified or not, or partly justified or not, that was absolutely beside the point. This was exactly the kind of political community we shouldn't become. We shouldn't become. It was the taboo that was born before our very eyes. And therefore, and also it was used very much against very effectively, not necessarily manipulatively. The thing was quite spontaneous, and it responded to very profound ideological needs. Well, manipulation is always added to that, of course, but responded to very profound needs in the formation of new political identities, namely that it could have been shown that if you resist the Washington consensus, if you resist liberal methods, peaceful, reasoned, gradual, reformist, based on noble individualism, tolerance, pluralism, etc., you'll end up like Milosevic. You'll end up in the cage. And you'll end up being humiliated, as indeed symbolically this country has been humiliated ever since, and still is, as we've seen these very days, not very long ago. Symbolic humiliation is going on. Now, again, whatever the truth of the matter may be, in The Hague, that's to specify my allusion. And, you know, so therefore, historical revisionism that has created the basis for the equation between Nazism and Bolshevism, between Stalinism and communism, between nationalism and communism, between the East and any kind of anti-capitalism, where anti-capitalism was equated with backwardness, ignorance, poverty, bad smells, right? It stinks, you know, it's something to do with poverty, backwardness, primitiveness, Asia, so it's very, very racist. And in character, like, you know, most capitalist legitimizing theories smack of racism, usually. Not always, but mostly. And sometimes consciously, sometimes not. So therefore, dealing with the practical problems, as you are as historians, dealing with the reconstruction of truth. I've heard, to the extent I understood through translation and so on, that how much effort is being paid to establish factual truth, to be analytical, to be critical, not to be biased, not to take sides, try to be objective. Yes, in other words, try to be like them. Try to be like the mentors and the examples and the ideals of everybody in Eastern Europe, i.e. the West. Whose ideal is to be unbiased, to be objective, to be analytical, and to be critical. That's indeed the Enlightenment ideal of Western Europe. And I have no quarrel with those things, actually, as it happens, but it smacks to me of trying to show that we are no worse. That if we have any complaints, East Europeans, I mean, any complaints, any objections to the dominant discourse, any aspirations that may counter the mainstream aspirations of the European Union, whatever it is, then those aspirations, those objections, those criticisms should stand up to a standard that is established outside. Well, being a fact that Eastern Europe is weaker than the West, it stands to reason that indeed we have to prove that our aspirations are as legitimate as others' aspirations, and the legitimacy of that aspiration of the West, of the powerful, of the establishment, of the mainstream, doesn't have to be proven, because that is taken as being a reason itself. So if you read the mainstream newspapers in Europe or anywhere, you know, you will read always that people's aspirations, for example, to resist austerity measures, balanced budgets, paying back all the debts and all those ideas, resisting austerity measures and balanced budgets and monetary policy, is unreasonable. It is based perhaps on people's needs. It is based perhaps on people's understandable passions. People want to eat. They want, you know, that's vulgar things. You know, they want to eat. They want their houses to be heated. They want their grandmothers to be treated in reasonably clean hospitals. They want their children to be taught the alphabet in reasonably clean and well-heated schools, and so on. But those are needs. Those are needs and not principles. Those are needs and not ideals. So needs, i.e., people as bodily beings, as physical beings, are being again opposed to reason, to the spirit that demands sacrifice, that demands abnegation, that demands self-denial, generosity, all, you know, generous ideas that are, in the traditional Christian way, opposed to bodily needs and selfishness. So it's very interesting that economic rationality, after centuries of Enlightenment ideology, is now presented in a quasi-religious garb as the point of view of the spirit, as opposed to the point of view of the passion. Now, everything that seems to be hostile to this, that is being rejected, collectivist passion, national passion, feelings of humiliation, of hurt pride, of memories, as Barrès said, la terre et les morts, you know, all those bases of nationalism and so on, and ideas of equality, which always are bound with ideas of equal dignity and so on, seem and are branded as irrational. So, you know, from something, historical revisionism, far from being that accursed and politically incorrect and unacceptable thing, has become one of the sources of today's consensus. And because its main result was, of course, a certain normalization of the enemy in the Second World War, which was for 40 years considered to be still the conflict. Just throw back your minds to the 1980s, in the 1980s still, it was perfectly obvious that the Axis was evil and the Allies were good. Okay? And even in spite of Stalin and in spite of atrocities committed by partisans or by the Czechoslovak Democratic Republic or the Polish resistance or whatever, they killed lots of civilians and did various unpleasant things, as we know, even in spite, not to speak of the Gulag, of course. And in spite of that, it was a moral boundary that was established in a very sharp way, and the whole celebration and the whole verbiage of the United Nations and all that, of course, is based on that. United Nations is, after all, a name for the Allies, the Allied side in the Second World War. And to break this up, to delegitimize the Soviet Union, and to treat the Second World War as basically like another conflict between nations, although perhaps worse, except maybe the Holocaust itself, that has been taken out of the conflict, sacralized, and treated differently from the rest of the conflict. And so the moment has come, for my generation, quite extraordinary moment, when you know, anti-fascist resistance is losing its sheen, its luster, its light. And maybe it deserves it. Nevertheless, I'm just establishing that this is so, and that the whole conflict has been normalized in the historical, or it is in the process of being normalized in the historical imagination, and the symbolic treatment of the Serbian side in the Yugoslav conflict suffered in consequence, is not at all something exceptional. It's been a very sharp and very heavy affair, and it has changed the perception of the ethnic mix of this part of Europe. Don't forget that there were times when Yugoslavia was considered to be the most progressive, interesting, original, and freedom-loving part of Eastern Europe. But there's been a time, and Serbia was part of it, or leading part of it. And now it has become something quite different. And of course, in the process, many things are being forgotten. The fact, for example, that the main substance of Southern Slav nationalisms in the 19th century has been actually unity and not separation, from Illyrism on. And after all, the SHS kingdom and Yugoslavia was a creation of various Southern Slav nationalisms. You know, like it was the case in Italy, like it was the case in Germany, like it was the case in Romania, and as it was the case of Czechoslovakia, it was unifying great state ideology. That has been, indeed, it was the Yugoslav conflict in which, for the first time, ethnicism has replaced nationalism. You know, classical nationalism has made great states from small principalities. Ethnicism makes small principalities from great nation states. Now we see the same in Britain. Soon we might have a Scottish independence. We see the same in northern Italy. We see the same in Catalonia. We see the same in the Basque country, and so on and so forth. All the great creations of 19th century irredenta nationalism, Cavour and Bismarck, and so on and so forth, and then Tache, Ionescu and Brătianu, and you know, and all these people, Maniu and all these people in Romania, and so on and so forth. This idea is dying, and on the one hand, the rational creations of great nation states that was presented as rational in the 19th century is frittered away, and now the unifying element is not any longer the great emancipatory nationalist ideas of 1848, but just the market, the only unifying force. Because ethnic and national statehoods are breaking up continuously. And they have been delegitimized to such an extent that the rebirth of greater federal edifices and so on and so forth is unlikely to reappear in our lifetime, if anything goes on like it does now. And so I think that talking about historical revisionism, well, of course, always provided that I'm right in what I'm saying, must take these things into account. It is not only an attempt by disreputable historians, liars, government propagandists, and so on. There's a lot of that, of course, but what's happening is not only peculiar interests that are being served by denying various things that may be in the favor of various nations that now are, getting the stick, not the carrot, for some historical reasons. No, it is a very important way in which the New World Order has been established and stabilized. And for this, like always, people need a view of things and the view of the living social world that consists, among other things, of states and nations and groups and classes and genders and all that. And the symbolic gradation and hierarchy in value between these groups is one of the most potent weapons, if handled properly, in the hands of those who retain power. Therefore, you have been, you Serbs, you have been made examples of, and an example that has to be learned, and not only by Serbs and by other Southern Slavs, but by all of us. Thank you.